our panel has all joined us. Again, a food processing industry in a post-COVID-19 world. Thank you again to TCF Bank for sponsoring this roundtable discussion. And thank you to Dr. Atkinson of the Atkinson Group for agreeing to lead this discussion. I'd like to announce the panelists next. Dennis, you can go to the next slide. Dr. Atkinson again from the Atkinson Group. Mr. Bon Holiday from Leprino Foods represents our cheese sector. Mr. Eric Rockefeller from River Ridge Cider Company represents our fruit sector. And Eric is one, River Ridge and Eric Rockefeller is one that from the beginning fully embraced and supported our initiative to an association and the farm moving forward. Wrote us letters of support and have always been there for us to help us move this association along. They really saw the vision, so we thank you for that, Eric. Mr. David Edwards of Kraft Heinz, Mr. Craig Ahrens of Kent Quality Foods. Again, now Dr. Atkinson will give the overview and status and share his perspectives, and then we'll go into some key questions and virtual Q&A with our panelists and our audience. Oh, I think we are waiting Dr. Atkinson's entry. So I can talk a little bit more about how we selected the panel while we're waiting for him. We really wanted to represent the entire sector. So that's why we chose one from each. That's why we chose a panelist from each of the different sectors. So, and we tried to keep as much of a focus as we could on Ottawa County because we are highlighting Ottawa County. So I'm going to just, Dennis, would you like us to move into panelist questions while we're waiting for Dr. Atkinson? If so, just advance that slide.
Marty, would you like to take a minute and let the panelists say a little bit about themselves, or do you want to be ready right when Dr. Atkinson comes on?
Sure, that sounds like a great idea. So, Bon, if you want to just introduce yourself and say a little bit more about your company, we're just waiting for Dr. Atkinson.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I work for Leprino Foods. We are the world's largest manufacturer of mozzarella. We've been in business just over 70 years this year. We here in Allendale take in about 2.6 million pounds of milk daily and process that out to close to 400,000 pounds of cheese a day. My experience here, I've been with the company going on 19 years. I started out in the quality realm, went over to production, and since then I've been able to advance up to the plant production manager. So.
That sounds great. Let's go to Eric next. Is Eric on? Oh, Eric has not been able to join us yet, so we are waiting. It looks like we're waiting Eric as well. So I see David is on. David, do you want to share a little more about Kraft Heinz and what you're doing?
Certainly. So good morning, everyone. Again, David Edwards. Again, Kraft Heinz. Again, I think everyone knows Kraft macaroni and cheese and Heinz ketchup. So here in Holland, we are primarily focused on the Heinz brand. So if you get Heinz mustard, Heinz relish, Heinz vinegar, Heinz barbecue sauce, you're getting it all made here locally in Holland, Michigan. So, you know, Kraft Heinz has 39 manufacturing locations in the United States and several more worldwide. So been around a long time. Obviously, the two companies merged in 2015 to become something even bigger. So I'm glad to be here. So thank you.
Thank you. And just another local connection is Swanson Pickle, of course.
Yes, we definitely work with Swanson a lot. So.
Yeah, our biggest pickle farmer here in Muskegon County. Also on my board, Katie Hensley is our board of directors chair for the association, and has a good, tight partnership with Kraft Heinz. So we're really glad to have you here today.
Thank you for having us.
Sure, thank you. Craig Ahrens.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me on as a panelist today. I work for Kent Quality Foods. We're a local manufacturer, co-packer of hot dogs, everybody's favorite food. We have two locations, one in almost downtown Grand Rapids on Leonard Street, and we recently built a greenfield facility here in Hudsonville, Michigan that opened in 2018. So we co-pack for a lot of customers that most people would recognize their names. We don't have a brand of our own that we have out there. But if you've been to local restaurants, you've probably had a Kent Quality Food hot dog. So appreciate the opportunity to be a part of the panel today and look forward to the conversation.
Well, and we are pleased to have you. Thank you for your time. I know it's a busy time, and it's really important for particularly our small food processors to hear from you all, but I know there are large companies on the webinar today as well. So Dr. Atkinson has been able to join us, and we welcome him today again of the Atkinson Group. And our sponsor is TCF Bank, as we mentioned. So Dr. Atkinson, you can take it away.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you today, and excited to be part of this group to talk about COVID-19 and a little bit of an update from me initially, and then obviously explore what lessons we're all learning and how we can continue to manage this, because clearly it is not going away. So what I plan to do is to sort of provide you with some general updates around what I'm seeing, and what we'll talk about is just some general trends in terms of what we're seeing currently in different parts of the country, and comment on the world. Let's focus a little bit on the ongoing challenges and the impact of influenza, which obviously is something that I think many are thinking about, is what's that going to do to, what are we seeing so far, and what's that going to do to our COVID-19 situation. And then finally, to get into what I see of where this is headed as we go forward, and then obviously jump into more thoughts from the panelists and some questions, hopefully. So let's go to the next slide as we start to talk about trends. As I look at the trends and sort of focus back on when this really began to impact us in North America, and we go back to mid-February when we started to see the first few cases on the West Coast, the explosion of cases in Europe, and then followed by an explosion of cases on the East Coast as the virus sort of spread its way across the world. Since then, obviously, we've seen big differences, state by state differences in terms of infectivity, case rates, progress, opening, not opening, economic pressures, many factors and variables that are impacting the way in which we're all having to handle this. On the global front, it's intriguing to watch what's going on in different parts of the world. What I believe we're seeing currently in the US is our third wave of cases, and I'll show some data in just a second to sort of explain a bit more what I'm seeing. But I'm sort of seeing it as the third wave. Some people talk about, oh, it's the second wave, but I'll show you what I mean. If we look globally, as I mentioned a few seconds ago, it's just we've got essentially in Italy and other parts of Europe, we saw an initial spike. It went down, and now they are struggling big time in Europe. If we look at the data that's up on the screen right now is US daily cases as of 2 or 3 days ago. And what I want to take away from this is what I mean about the 3 phases. We spiked up steeply in March as it caught hold, mainly on the East Coast. It then began to drop down. We saw a second big wave in the summer. And again, as you'll all remember, that was not on the East Coast. That was mostly Arizona. It was Texas. It was California. It was Florida. It was states that hadn't seen a lot in the first wave. It then began to diminish. And now, as you can see very clearly, we're on our third wave, which we will speculate as to where that's going to go as we go forward. But the state-by-state variations are really quite striking. Let's go to the next slide, where we look at what happened in New York. Very, very high initial case rates, very high mortality rates. A lot of changes in New York drove the numbers down. And apart from a sort of little blip recently, it's basically stayed down. So obviously one of the questions is what's going on in New York that has controlled this? And I think part of the control in New York is just a recognition, like, this was really scary. It was very worrying. I think, frankly, a lot of people left the state, but it was a whole life change. It was a whole way of dealing with this. If we look at what's going on in Michigan, I thought that would be a good state to look at. So let's go to the next slide. And Michigan saw the initial bump in March, just like New York did in many other states. They saw the drop, little blip in June, July, but not big relative to the country as a whole. And now we're heading up in a more worrying upward trend. So overall, as we look at the country, I believe we're in phase 3. We'll talk a bit more about what that means now and going forward in just a second, but also looking at what's driving these numbers. And let's go to the next slide. Because as we start to look at those numbers, you sort of say to yourself, well, we're seeing the case rate go up, but is that having as much of an impact as it did the first time around? And I thought I would show some other data to try to sort of get into that a little bit. And this is the reported daily death rate in the United States from COVID. And it tracks with phase 1 and phase 2. The death rate in the early part of this disease in the end of March and April was clearly very high. It dropped off as the case rate dropped. It bumped up a little bit as we went into wave 2. And then since then, it started to go down. Now, the thing about a death rate is this is hard to define. Determining that somebody has died as a direct result of COVID is difficult. And there's been a lot of questions about, as we know, elderly people with comorbidities are more likely to get the virus and do badly. So if somebody's got severe terminal cancer, for example, and they get COVID and they die, but they're already on a trajectory where it's terminal anyway, and perhaps COVID has accelerated that, sadly, it's counted sometimes as a COVID death, but is it really a COVID death? In reality, yes. If the person hadn't got the virus, they probably would have lived a little longer. So I think trying to sort of break this all apart is tricky. But I wanted to show this to sort of put it in really context of the case rates and the death rates, which are not, they're tracking in terms of the overall trends, but they're not tracking in terms of the size of the numbers, so why is that? We'll get to that in just a second. Let's go to the next slide. And this is data which is hard to get. It's hard to really find this information, and this relates to hospitalization rates, which is obviously the sort of the middle part of the equation. Somebody gets the virus, they may get diagnosed, they don't necessarily go to hospital. And if they do go to hospital, one hopes that they recover and get out. They're not necessarily going to die. But if we look at the hospitalization rates, and this is from CDC, it lags a couple of weeks, but you see the same sort of shaped curve, significant increase in the early part of the phase 1 through March, April, dropped, goes up again in the summer, drops, but it's sort of staying down. And the reason I launched to just show the death rate and the hospitalization rate is so far, it is not tracking upward as much as the cases are. That's not to diminish the significance of what's going on. It's simply to point out that we've made some improvements. We're making some changes, and we can't necessarily compare the numbers today with the numbers in March, because there is a difference in terms of outcomes, death, and hospitalization. So let's go to the next slide as we explore this just a little further. So what do the numbers mean? And part of it is, how hard are you looking for cases? As I'm sure you will all remember, back in March, when COVID first hit us in the US, getting a test was difficult. You basically, if you call the doctor and said, hey, I don't feel well, I've got a fever, I've got a cough, the doctor would say, well, are you struggling to breathe? Do you need to go to the hospital? And if the answer was no, it was, well, stay at home, isolate. We don't have the resources to do a test. You've probably got the virus, but we can't do anything about it. So just stay home and look after yourself. Since then, the volume of testing has gone up dramatically. And so we have got much better at finding the virus. Part of the way to look at that is to ask the question, what's the number of positives per 100,000 population, to try to normalize that. That links into the number of tests per 100,000 population, because again, you may find a low number of positives because you're not looking very hard. Certain states, like California, like New York, are looking really hard. They're doing a lot of tests, and so the accuracy of the data is high. So understanding what these numbers mean and how to put it all in context is important. As I've tried to illustrate, absolutely, the total number of cases are going back up again in the third wave. Hospitalization rates are not changing as much, and death rates aren't changing as much either. Those last two clearly are lagging indicators of cases. But I think there is cause for hope that the medical system, the medical professionals, the hospitals have got much more efficient and better at managing this disease than we had back in March. Part of that is because we have some new medications around that are working. None of them are perfect. None of them are 100%. But the combination of some of these drugs, like remdesivir, clearly are reducing mortality, particularly if they're given early. So I think part of the message here is, yes, the numbers are going up, but it's important to look beyond just the pure case rates, and glimmers of hope that while we're very much not out of this, we are at least in a way where we're managing it better. Having said that, we're not short of challenges. Let's go to the next slide. So after looking at the numbers, we still have a lot of challenges. And I know my industry employees this will resonate with all of us. We've been struggling with this since February, as I said, and I think when we first realized early March, it's like, wow, we've got something that's going to change our lives here. None of us quite expected that we'd be having these discussions, doing meetings virtually at the end of October. If you remember, it was, oh, this will be over by Easter, and once spring break is passed, it's all going to go away. The summer will kill the virus. Clearly, none of that has happened. The overall sort of challenge that I see is the third bullet I've got here, is dealing with COVID-19 weariness. Everybody is worn out. Everybody wants to get back to normal. No one will quite define what normal is anymore, but they want to get back to something other than where we are. And I think recognizing for all of us that are part of critical infrastructure is we've got a job to do. We've got food to move through the supply chain, and our employees are our most important asset. They really are key. They're absolutely critical. They're weary, they're worn out, as is all the management and everybody trying to manage this. So employee concerns, expectations, where things are going. There is a sort of a drumbeat of, oh yeah, we're kind of used to this now. We know what to do. We're managing it. But as it continues to you hear on the news constantly, cases are going up, it's changing, and different jurisdictions have got different impacts of legislation and executive orders, and it's just simply not going away. One of the challenges that I get asked about is, are we going to run out of personal protective equipment? I'm not seeing that at all. Initially, there was again the struggle to get any sort of PPE. Stockpiles were low, we didn't have it. Today, that seems to be readily available. And as you all remember, we went through that interesting shift, a 180 around masks don't work, and then yes, masks do work. And that's like, what was that all about? So I think the availability of all of those types of personal protective equipment continues to be fairly robust. Testing availability, as I said, is now pretty robust. Wherever you go, you can get a test, you can get it quickly. Tests are evolving. And I think an interesting strategy that we might want to get into with the panel is the sorts of testing that you're thinking about doing. Some companies are testing proactively. Some companies are offering tests to employees. Some companies are not. So there's different strategies around how to do that. Remembering that the type of test you take has got different levels of accuracy. Some have high false positives or false negatives. Some are very accurate. Some take 15 minutes, some take several days. So testing remains a challenge. When to test, how to test, should we test? Another challenge is different approaches from public health officials. Across our 50 states, we've almost got 50 different ways this is being managed. Doesn't help, particularly with a company that's got operations in multiple jurisdictions. It makes life very difficult. You have to be tracking with what's going on at the local level. And keeping in mind that Centers for Disease Control offers guidance. That's what they're about. They don't tell you what to do. They give you guidance. It's the local public health officials at county level, at state level, that are actually putting out specific requirements and regulations and things that you have to do to meet them and not be in default. So there's still a great deal of challenge remaining as we look to where this is further headed. So what does the future hold? Let's move on to the next slide as we start to look at where we are. One of the questions that comes up a lot in the last month is the impact of influenza. So I did want to touch on that. And influenza is a respiratory virus. It spreads exactly the same way as COVID-19. Symptoms are very similar. If you look down the list of the 11 symptoms that are on the CDC website for COVID-19 and put them next to the symptoms for influenza, they overlap almost 100%. So how do you manage that at an industry level? Somebody comes to work and hopefully you've got a wellness check. Do you have a fever? Do you have aches and pains? Do you have a headache, a sore throat, a cough? And if the answer to any of that is yes, then you exclude that person. And you don't bring them back until you feel confident that they're not infectious and that they are well. Some people have said, well, should we exclude people with influenza in the same way? And my answer absolutely is yes, you should. And I say that for two reasons. One is that you do not want somebody with influenza coming to work and spreading those symptoms around. So you have yet more people who have aches and pains and a cough and a headache and a sore throat and possibly a low-grade fever. You don't know what it is. So they do need to be excluded because you don't know what's going on. I think as a society, we've sort of thought, oh, I just got a touch of the flu. I don't feel great, but I'm going to come to work. That's our philosophy generally. And I think as a result of that, we've probably spread flu more than we should have. And influenza, as I said, spreads exactly the same way as COVID. Difference with influenza is there is a vaccine. We never know year by year whether the vaccine is going to work. We don't know yet whether this year's vaccine is going to work because the influenza virus, as you probably all know, changes. It mutates and it moves from one type of influenza to a different one. And the vaccine cocktails change on a yearly basis, which is why we have to have an influenza vaccine every year. The other difference is that there are treatments available for influenza that are effective if given early. Again, unlike COVID, where there are some treatments, but they're not necessarily as effective. We've talked a little bit about managing employees with symptoms of influenza and keeping them out. The other thing to keep in mind is all the protective things that we do for COVID: social distancing, mask wearing, hand washing, reacting to being sick. All of those different interventions that we have become a way of life for COVID will reduce the spread of influenza as well. So what are we seeing so far with influenza? Let's go to the next slide. And I thought this was something that I would just share with you. It's very early days, but what this figure shows is the influenza positivity rates from the Centers for Disease Control, looking at data going back to September last year. So the graph that's up on the screen, over on the left there, we've got the number of cases basically, and across the bottom we've got the time, and the time isn't done by date, it's done by week, and it's a little hard to read, so I'm sorry about that. But what I want to point out is that over there on the left-hand side of the main curve there, that goes back to week 40 from last year, which is sort of roughly the September timeframe. And as you can see, as the timeline moved, the influenza numbers peak and then fall. The green and the yellow just reflect different types of the virus, but you can see the overall trend here. I want to just, as we track out across to the right-hand side of the graph, you can see it's flat, and you barely see anything at all over the recent weeks. The little inset above is just an expansion of that area that's under the bracket. So the scale over there on the left-hand side of this figure it goes from 5, 10, 15, 20,000. The scale on the little insert there, if you look at it, is going up to 25, 50, and 75. So it's a real blow up of that little area there. And so far, what we can see up to the current data, and this was as of the beginning of this week, the total numbers of influenza cases in the US is really, really low, and significantly lower so far this year than it was this time last year. What that means is essentially that to date, influenza has not taken off yet in the US. It doesn't mean it won't. We don't know whether this trend that we're seeing here is because this year's virus isn't particularly tough and it doesn't cause a lot of infection. We don't know whether it's the fact that everybody is thinking COVID and the same protections are working. So it's not clear exactly what this is due to. It's probably a combination of all of those factors. But I think the key message here on influenza is you cannot differentiate between the symptoms, and you need to continue to work on the basis of you have a sick employee with that list of symptoms, you don't know what it is, and they should be excluded until you can figure it out. So let's go to the next slide, which starts to just, as a wrap up from me here, is speculation on what the future holds. We have cold weather. Well, if you remember back in the early days of COVID pandemic, there was speculation that as the summer comes, the virus will die off, and certainly it doesn't like ultraviolet light, it will die off. The other factor about the summer is we go outside. The risk of spread outdoors is definitely much less. I'm not a firm believer that in the cold weather, the virus is suddenly going to multiply a whole lot more. But what it does do is it changes human behavior. It drives us inside because it's cold. We don't do as much outdoor activity. And when we're inside, we're in closer quarters and the virus tends to spread more. So the cold weather definitely has an impact on spread. And it has an impact that increases the spread because of human behaviors. So based on that, based on the fact that schools have opened, colleges have opened, different jurisdictions are opening more than others. We're generally on a trend of opening, not closing. Then that's what's driven our third wave. It was, to my way of thinking, it was anticipated. How big it will get, I don't know. But it is definitely anticipated, and it's probably going to continue to rise over the next several weeks or so. Second thing in relation to what does the future hold is a vaccine. There's a great deal of news media talk about vaccines. The vaccines are coming. They're in phase 3 clinical studies, which means that they're being given to thousands of individuals to look for safety and to look for effectiveness. The vaccine argument is going to be a very interesting one. I think one is hearing, well, we don't want to take a vaccine unless we know it's safe, and I certainly support that. A vaccine is designed to be an intervention that protects you from a disease. And when the intervention itself causes a disease or causes illness or death, then that's clearly a really bad thing. So we want the vaccines first and foremost to be safe. Ideally, we want them to be effective. If they don't work very well, but they're safe, that's a risk that people may be willing to take. If they work really well, but are unsafe, that's a risk people won't be willing to take. I think there will be a lot of skittishness around whether vaccines are acceptable, and their availability, it will take time before they're widely available. They probably will be available early part of next year is my best guess, assuming the trials pan out. So far, we haven't heard much whether they're working or not. It's all done through controlled studies. They're blinded, so we'll have to see. As we look to the future, maintaining employee wellness. Going back to my key points, our employees are key. They're really important. We've got to keep them well, focused, deal with the COVID weariness they're facing, we're facing. Many companies thought, oh, well, 6 months from now, we'll be out the other side. We can manage virtually for that length of time. We'll get some string, we'll get some duct tape, and we'll keep the company going. We're fine. Now it's like, man, we need to meet. Leadership hasn't met in the same room for months. How do we manage that? And we have to continue to address that and try to deal with it. Continuing with preventive controls to reduce risk is as important today as it always was. There is no one thing that prevents the spread of this virus. It truly is a combination. Number one, understanding how it spreads, which we do. Respiratory droplet, close contact, person to person. Leveraging controls, social distancing is part of it. Covering faces is a part of it. Washing hands, cleaning contact surfaces is a part of it. There's no one thing there that manages all the risk. Continuing to put it together as a package for overall risk control is our best strategy at continuing to drive through this. My anticipation is that we are going to continue to struggle with this through the winter into the early part of next year. We need to be looking at 3 months minimum of continued challenges, and I'm being optimistic at that, and it may be longer. I'm hopeful by spring next year we'll be in a very different place, but this vaccine continues to surprise us. Factors such as a treatment, vaccines, other things may well and likely will impact the timelines, the case numbers, and the risk. So still lots going on. And again, I appreciate being able to share some of those thoughts with you, and look forward to some questions and discussion with my panel colleagues. So I'll hand back to you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dr. Atkinson. A lot of food for thought and a look at how what the future holds or may hold. We are going to, for those attendees, please, if you would like to at any point, enter your questions in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can on the webinar today, and we will also ask Dr. Atkinson and the other panelists to follow up. We'll coordinate that. But for right now, we're moving into the part where our panelists will answer these 2 key questions, and we'll start with Bon. What has challenged you the most through the COVID crisis so far?
And I know we kind of talked about it earlier, and it's not as bad now, but supply and demand for the PPE side of it, when we were trying to go through masks, when we were trying to go through sanitizer, when we were trying to help give those personal protective equipment to the employees so they didn't have to bring in their own, just keeping up in stock. We also have a function where our employees are wearing garment that came from Malaysia. And so during that time frame, we lost a lot of stuff coming from overseas. We were looking for vendors that were in the States that did not make the same quality that we were getting from across seas. So it was hard to build a safety stock for PPE during that time frame. Again, now, you know, 7 months into it, we're in a lot better place than where we were. But during that first 2-3 months, it was very difficult for the supply and demand. And actually, our business never slowed down. It actually increased with more people staying home, and pizza deliveries, if you think about that, that increased quite a bit. So from Leprino's standpoint, very great, right? We did good with selling more product than we ever had in our record history. But during the same time, how do you keep your employees safe?
Thank you, Bon. Eric, we'll go to you next, and welcome to, and thank you for your time today. I know this is a busy time for apple packers and apple cider producers. What has challenged you the most through COVID-19 crisis so far?
Well, we had the same issues like Bon just said, and then probably expanding on that has been supplies in general. You know, with our suppliers, it's been somewhat of a challenge to get packaging and other materials for us to stay running. And then the employee situation, you know, whether people have had whether they have had COVID or think they have COVID, the testing early on, and to some extent the testing has been a challenge. I wish we could get the, you know, I hear about the 15-minute test on TV. I think that would definitely be a benefit for our company. We've had people that have been off several days to go and get negative tests, you know. So maintaining the workforce is an ongoing challenge too for us. So
Thank you.
That's about it.
Thank you, Eric. And we'll move on to Kraft Heinz with David. Same question. What has challenged you the most through the COVID-19 crisis so far?
You know, I would say, again, it's been managing the people. You know, again, like Bon said, we've been at this from the beginning and demand has increased. So, you know, in the beginning, we had to manage everyone's fears and concerns and, you know, okay, are we essential workers? Are we allowed to work? And, you know, really stressing the importance of the role that we play, even though we're a condiment. You know, we had to ensure that people really understand the vitalness of what they provide to the American public during this time. And then we continued on, and as we learned more and implemented more, so then you had to go through the whole change management. Masks, you know, we implemented face shields along with masks, and, you know, increased cleaning protocols, and, you know, all the change management that went through it. And then, as Dr. Atkinson also alluded to, now the challenge is to continue to keep people engaged in the importance of doing the cleaning, the hand washing, the social distancing, the proper wearing of masks, right? I mean, I go out, you know, in the community, and, you know, I can spot someone not wearing their mask over their nose a mile away, you know. And how do you continue driving those behaviors? Because people are getting tired of, you know, having to do those things, you know, every day. So that's what, you know, again, we definitely had the challenges everyone else has alluded to so far, but, you know, I think managing the people through the cycle of, you know, the pandemic has been the most challenging for myself.
Thank you. And we'll finish up this first question with Craig from Kent Quality Foods.
We faced many of the same challenges that were mentioned by Bon and Eric and David. But the biggest challenge for us when the pandemic first hit and the lockdown started was our business primarily focused on food service type applications of products, so bulk packs that went out to restaurants across the country. And overnight, restaurants shut down, customers canceled orders, and what we had to do was really shut our business down for a couple of days. Fortunately for us, we were able to work with some customers to basically turn to retail, which was something that we really didn't do a lot of, and basically have to retool our facilities to be able to support the demand. And so we went from a normal business cycle to essentially shutting our business cycle down to launching new products in retail type applications. And then volume for those items really took off because, as you know, a hot dog is a fairly cheap source of protein. And so we went from not having work for people to not having enough people to support the work that we need to do. And to date, that's our biggest challenge is managing the people and finding additional resources to meet the needs of our customer base. So as we continue to move forward, we see that as a continued challenge based on managing of the folks through the process, the symptoms, dealing with that, sending people out when they don't feel well or have symptoms, and trying to fill those vacancies to be able to meet long-term customer demand.
Thank you all very much. So we have one more one more question for this particular part. So we'll start again with Bon. What have you had to do to mitigate the challenges outside of CDC and other guidelines? And what have been the most challenging to implement? The most challenging to implement is something that we get many questions on.
Yeah. So in our industry and in our process that we do here in Allendale, we have close to 10 to 13 to 15 people on a line. And obviously social distancing is one of the key elements of preventing the spread. And it was, how do we not impact throughput and figure out how to keep people at a social distance acceptable to not impact our process. So it was very difficult to separate at 6 feet 15 people, but we did go to a divider system that stood 6.5 feet tall. So it gave you proper spacing and proper height to not let anything waft over or anything from a person-to-person contact standpoint. That really helped putting those dividers up. And another thing was outside of the CDC, obviously a lot of people, going back to what David said about essential workers, that started to spur up the conversations of, okay, hazard pay. So that was a very difficult one for the company to see through. Instead of calling it a hazard pay, we did do a appreciation pay at the end of each month for, I think it was the first 5 months. Now it's kind of normal business, but that was a very difficult one for us to do, because we didn't want to call it a hazard, because we did still want to show them appreciation and that they were essential to our infrastructure, but we didn't want to call it a hazard. We did it out of our appreciation for the employees.
Thank you. Eric, we'll move on to you with what have you had to do to mitigate the challenges outside of the guidelines, CDC and other guidelines, and what have been the most challenging to implement?
Yeah, probably, we've done different things, like Bon said, with the separation of the employees and stuff, but just getting the employees trained that if they're not feeling good, to stay home or let us go, or let us know that they're not feeling well. I think that's been the biggest issue with all of our all of our operations is people just kind of wanting to come to work, even they think they just have the flu or something like that, or maybe they do, but anyway, that's the one thing that sticks out is people actually being healthy coming to work.
Yeah, thank you. David?
So again, we didn't probably have as much challenges as Bond did. We did have some spaces that people had to work within the 6 feet, but for us, within the guidelines was the communication. So especially with our lead employees and our supervisors that had to have conversations, working in a noisy manufacturing environment, it was already hard enough to talk, so it requires that close contact. So, you know, again, we made a tough decision early on to not only go to face masks, but to go to face shields and face masks. So basically every employee had their own personal barrier when talking. But I think, you know, outside of the CDC guidelines, for us was the demand for vinegar, right? Vinegar is, you know, dual purpose, you know, cooking, but, you know, a lot of people use vinegar for cleaning. So our demand has really shot up. We're still working, you know, 6+ days a week to meet the demands, and we'll be continuing for a while. You know, that's led to, you know, supplier issues. So we're really having to work with our suppliers and increase their capacities as they're dealing with COVID as well. And additionally, that's something that we had worked really hard to make our operation much more efficient by not changing over as much and kind of doing things in a planned succession to minimize that downtime and startup time. But, you know, with that, the demands, we've basically had to change over every single week. So we're running 6 days a week, and then on that 7th day, having to change over our line. So that's really been, you know, our big challenge here, you know, at our facility.
Great, thank you. Finishing up the second question with Craig from Kent Quality Foods.
Thank you. For us, communication has been a challenge. The structure that we had in place with morning stand-ups and meetings with the team members on the floor to be able to set the plan for the day and be able to communicate on a very regular basis in close proximity really challenged us in how we needed to step back and look at how we communicate and what we communicate. We've got TVs in our production areas that basically we can communicate what's happening within the organization and keep the associates up to date on changes and things that we're working to implement. So communication has been a challenge. We've mitigated that or try to mitigate that through the implementation of technology and digital signage, and just ensuring that we're keeping people informed, because there are a lot of questions that have come up since really the outbreak had happened, and what's the direction of the company, where are we going, what are we going to do, and how are we keeping people safe as they come to work each and every day. So it continues to be a struggle and a challenge. I think we've become very adept communicate with the team members and being able to have that feedback come back from the floor, be able to react to the issues that they experience with, whether it be PPE, masks, and things of that nature that we've implemented in order to fall in line with the CDC guidelines.
Thank you. Just wanted to remind the audience, any questions that you have, enter into the Q&A chat box. And also, if you raise your hand, Brian will unmute you if you would like to ask the question yourself. I'd also like to ask Dr. Atkinson, would you like to comment on what you've heard on these two questions before we go on to the final questions for this round?
No, thank you. You know, I think that's great insights from the 4 individuals, and clearly doing a wonderful job. And you know, listening to some of the challenges you talked about, Bon, in terms of you know, how do we manage that social distancing in a plant where you're not designed to be socially distanced, and you know, in your business, that's one where it's been a struggle, and obviously meat and poultry, it's been a huge struggle. It's just how do you maintain those operations and do it successfully. I think your point about PPE is an interesting one. Yeah, it was a real struggle, and it's so far it seems to be less of a problem, but it hasn't completely gone away, even though it doesn't seem a huge challenge. You know, I think reflecting back on testing, and I forget who was it who mentioned that. I think maybe it was I don't know who it was, about 15-minute test, but those are desirable tests, and no one can get them. They're hard to get, but you know, keep in mind with testing is it's a point of time test. It only tells you what the status was at the time the swab was taken or the saliva sample was taken. But those 15-minute tests can be very helpful, and some of the cost on those has come way down. They're very inexpensive if you can get them, but right now they're still not a useful tool. The comment about supply chain is an interesting one. And I think many supply chains have struggled for the same reasons we've all struggled, because they're facing the same issues as we are with employee wellness and consistency. And one of the things that I've heard talked about a lot, but haven't actually seen an overt example of, is an increased risk for economically motivated adulteration. As suppliers get put under pressure to meet the demand of a customer, there's a bit more of a temptation with some perhaps to cut a corner and to embark on an economically motivated adulteration strategy, particularly if it's an imported product perhaps. So just something to watch out for. Another drumbeat that comes up, which I haven't heard anybody mention, and thankfully in the US it has not been a big issue, is whether or not this virus is transmitted through food itself. Some parts of the world have made a big deal of that, and that has led to some significant economic consequences of refusing food, particularly meat and poultry. It hasn't really impacted the United States, but it certainly impacted Canada and other parts of the world. So again, looking at the science, that there's no indication that the virus is spreading through food or through food packaging. That was a concern at first, and thankfully for once all of us in the food industry dealing with an infectious agent, that when it isn't spreading through food. There's no evidence that it ever has, and but it continues to pop up on a regular basis. And I think we just constantly have to be vigilant to look out for that and make sure that doesn't suddenly gain traction in the media. And then my final thought, which sort of gets back to something I think Craig was talking about, and that's the pivoting that you had to do as you moved away from essentially a restaurant business into, now what do we do? And you pivot and you go towards retail. Lots of people have done that. And you commented on, you know, the challenges around that, and you're dealing with absenteeism, you're dealing with employees that are sick, you need to keep your baseline employees well, but you're looking for temps, you're looking for you're looking for others that can come in and fill in because you've got production demands to meet. And I think everybody is struggling with the same issue. And when you bring temps in, what do you know about them? You've got to train them. And we didn't talk about conventional food safety so far, but you know, I think we're all in the food business, and we need to continue to stay really vigilant on that score, because the challenges around that have gone up. And I say that because we rely on the consistency of our trained employees, people who know what to do, but we're having to shift people, and they're doing jobs they perhaps aren't completely used to. We're bringing in temps that clearly don't know our system, they don't know our culture, they don't possibly even know how to do GMPs properly. We've got to train them, we've got to watch them. And at the same time, our QA people who do know what they're doing, and certainly in some instances, and I don't know whether you've all experienced that, but they've had to go do other things. It's like, well, we need them on the line. We need, you know, we're short on a line today, and we got to get, so the QA person is like, well, you do your QA stuff for some of the day, and then we need you on the production line this afternoon because we're short. And I'm not saying that's happened a lot, but all of these are just adding stresses and strains to our underlying core business of making food high quality and safe. And while obviously we've got a mix of companies here that are under FDA and USDA jurisdiction, the USDA seemed to have just kept on going. The FDA obviously changed their strategy around inspections. They stopped doing routine inspections for a period. Those are now coming back online, but they're generally giving you notice when they're going to show up. For cause inspections have not stopped. Hopefully none of you have had to get into a for cause inspection, but my experience is that the regulatory bodies are being very aggressive around anything that's popping up that could be an outbreak or could be clusters. We've seen a couple, and interestingly, during this pandemic, we've seen two types of produce, onions and peaches, both linked pathogens for which we've never seen before. And that's just indicative that there is no loss of vigilance from the public health officials around conventional food safety. And while that's not the focus of this discussion, it's part of what we do every single day. And the challenges to maintain that have just got harder. But great discussion, Marty. I think there's great comment. So
thank you. Thank you. We do have a couple audience questions, and I'll ask the question, and then please, panelist or Dr. Atkinson, jump in. The first one is from John Keenahan in Oceana County of Hanson Logistics. So he said they're seeing COVID cases being defined by OSHA employee standards. Therefore, the employee comp insurance pays for it. Have there been any discussions with providers or any compensation to help cover this cost? Anybody?
We haven't had any kind of conversations yet around that. We are aware that OSHA is now more being in correspondent with COVID, going to validate that facilities and other workplaces are being maintained in a safe manner. But so far, nothing around the compensation of insurance.
Great, thank you. Anyone else before we go on to the next one?
I'll comment that I've seen big differences in different parts of the country in relation to OSHA retention and workers' comp, and some areas have got really quite focused on that. And this whole question, and I'm certainly not an OSHA expert, but this notion of an OSHA reportable situation, that's evolved, it's changed, and OSHA has definitely got itself involved in this. So yeah. It's something that we need to be watching very carefully. And I think that again speaks to the vigilance and maintaining that vigilance, because people have got sick and people have died. Hopefully no one on this call has had that situation where they've lost a plant worker. But, let's not forget there's litigation floating out there too, and constantly maintaining vigilance and staying in front of that curve to be able to demonstrate appropriate due diligence is going to be important in the grand scheme of things, as OSHA and attorneys and others continue to play this out.
Thank you. We'll go on to the next one, and this is from Joan Kimball Morgan from the Upper Peninsula. Welcome, Joan. What have been your largest challenges specifically related to supply chain? I think a couple of you touched on that.
Yeah, from our perspective, we bring in raw meat, or what we call trim, that comes from the slaughter facilities. And as everybody saw, that was broadcast in the news, there were severe outbreaks at these processing plants. So at that point in time, it was the availability to be able to get the raw material. That's been addressed with changes that have been made. And now the issue, at least that we're seeing in our business, is the quality of the product that's coming in has kind of taken a step back, as well as the amount of what we call foreign material that we're finding or seeing within the trim itself, which has caused us to really have to scrutinize raw material as it comes through our facility to ensure that we don't have any food safety or contamination issues get into our processes.
Thank you. And we'll finish up with this final question from Michigan State University Product Center. Our good friend and colleague, Kendra Wills, mentioned that MSU just made the decision that the students will not be going on spring break to mitigate the spread of COVID. Have any of the employers thought about anything related to spring break, vacations with your employees?
Yeah, one thing that we've done, we've asked our employees if they're traveling outside of the state to let us know. Obviously, we don't want to handcuff anyone from living their lives outside of work, but we did ask if they did travel to a red state before they return to work, a negative COVID test is required.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to comment on that?
I will comment, to Bon's point. I think as we get into holiday season, it's going to be important to establish a policy in your company as to what to do about this and not to be scrambling at the last minute. I mean, there's the policies around business travel, which I regard as a separate channel, but important nevertheless. But then there's the policies around people who've gone to family or traveled to vacation just for personal reasons. And as you say, Bon, you don't want to lock people out of leading their lives because you've got to maintain their goodwill. You've got to maintain their willingness to be team players. And part of that is taking time off when you need it. But at the same time, recognizing that, if somebody has traveled with their family to another family member for a long weekend and everybody's completely, safe and they're being very focused on doing the right things, the risk there is really low versus somebody who's hopped on a plane and flown to a big resort or been to a wedding or some other gathering of 200 people where the risk is very different. So part of it is to try to establish a policy that is trying to differentiate the risk, and sort of simple way is to look at travel. Is it high risk? Is it low risk? And if it's low risk, you might want to, wait 7 days and then let them back. If it's high risk, then obviously to your point, Bon, testing, keeping them out 14 days until you're absolutely sure. And I would just comment on testing is that, we know this virus is, when you get it, the average incubation period is about 5 days. So when you get exposed, the point at which you get symptoms, average is 5, but it can be as long as 14. So it's like the question is, when should I do a test? And if you've been exposed on Monday and you do the test on Tuesday and say, oh, I'm negative, I'm fine, that's not true. You're not necessarily fine because there hasn't been enough time. So given the challenges of getting tests, the optimal time to do a test is on day 7. And that's because by then you're likely to have got symptoms. If you haven't got symptoms, you're about to get them, more likely than not. So you're likely to kick up a positive on day 7. And that's really in the context, if you can do one test, which is still a challenge, getting more than one test is hard. But if you're going to do one test, then that's the day I would pick to do it following an exposure. And if that's negative and usually take a couple of days to get the result back. So that's up to day 10. If they still got no symptoms and that test is negative, you've got a pretty high confidence that they're going to be okay. But to your point, Bon, having a policy is a good strategy.
Yeah. We actually went to a serology testing as well. It does take a little bit longer, but just to make sure that they build up an immunity to that, that's been beneficial because we've had several people go out positive multiple times. So before we continue to bring them back and expose anyone, we want to make sure they have enough immunity built up. Yeah.
No, and that raises another interesting point. If we've got another second, is that certainly shows that there's been an exposure and there's immunity. We don't yet know for sure whether that immunity is completely protective. There've been a few reports where people have had the virus and then they got reinfected. So the whole immunity question is an interesting one, whether it's short term or long term. But no, and that's why that's the value of these conversations, is because the science does keep shifting.
Mm-hmm.
We have to try to stay current.
Well, thank you. Would anyone like to comment before we go on to the final round of questions and wrap up on anything that we've talked about so far? Otherwise, Dennis will advance the screen and we'll be on with our final round. So Bon, this one is for you. What are some best practices that you have implemented due to COVID-19 that will remain best practices in your operation beyond the pandemic? This is a question we get from educators a lot.
Yeah. So with going back, we talked a lot about social distancing and, you know, how we do that with training, right? We still, like I said, our production stayed up. We were still hiring during this time frame. So we had new employees and training that had to be done. And, you know, the team on the floor asked, you know, how do we efficiently train and still keep that social distance? So what we did was we went out and researched these new headsets that are made specifically for the floor, a wash down area that can run up to 200 feet apart, which is enough social distance for a football field. But what it was is, you know, how do you continuously train, get the communication out there real time while you're training? And these headsets, as you put them on, you don't have to key a mic. It's continuous two-way communication between the trainer and trainee. And again, you have up to 200 feet of distance that you can put in between you. In prior times, you know, we always heard it's loud out on the floor. You have your PPE in, you got your earplugs in. It's very hard to hear. So going forward into the future, we will keep these headsets to continue our training out on the floor, so communication is effective out there.
That's great. Thank you, Bon. And the second question I'm going to hold, it was for Eric, but a result of living in the COVID world is he is in a rural area of Newaygo County and just got bounced off our webinar. So he's trying to rejoin. If he's able to rejoin, we'll circle back to that question or I'll give you all a chance to answer it. So David, this one is for you. What are some lessons you have learned that you're willing to share with others?
Yes, thank you. So we talked about, I'd say plan ahead, you know, especially as it relates to PPE and supplies, right? I mean, I think all of us have learned to operate lean and just in time, but, you know, I think, you know, with the waves and potential worsening is to plan ahead and be proactive in order that, right? I think for us, you know, here is have a consistent message and repeat that message often, right? I mean, I still do, you know, town halls and discussions with plant, and I'm repeating the same message that I was repeating back in March, and just repeat that same simple message over and over and over. So now they get tired of hearing it, but to repeat that. And then, like I said, for us, you know, again, Bon's got the headsets, and I think that's a great opportunity that we need to explore. But like I said, for us with, you know, our leads and our supervisors that have to interact with multiple people, you know, we made that decision to not only put people in masks, but face shields, so that, you know, when you had to come within that 6 feet to have discussions and relay information, you know, that people that both workers were safe. So those were kind of the three lessons that I would like to share.
Thank you very much. And we'll go to Craig. What resources or relationships have you formed or further enforced resulting from this pandemic?
I would say with a couple of our key customers, we've actually been able to grow the relationship and really our ability to be very nimble during this pandemic and be able to meet the needs of the requirements. And in many cases, you know, we're co-packing for people who have the capability to be able to make the products that we make for them. But they had severe labor shortage issues compared to what we dealt with. And so the ability for us to be able to react quickly and really be able to support a couple of key customers has really done well for our business. And, you know, we've seen our sales increase. And, you know, we're looking at, you know, 20+% growth between 2020 and 2021 because of our ability to be able to meet their needs and the relationships that we formed with them.
Thank you very much. So we do have, we'll see if Eric comes back on, we'll get him involved in the discussion. But before we wrap up, we do have one other question from Clarence Rudat from MSU. He's from MSU IAT and will be doing the presentation after we finish here. He's been a great supporter from the beginning for the association and for FARM and connecting the educational curriculum of MSU to our industry here in West Michigan and to the work we're doing through the association. So thank you, Clarence. His question is for anyone to answer that has this situation. Those who have plants in other states with maybe different sets of rules, how has that impacted you specifically when you're sending Michigan product to these other plants in other states? And if someone would like to comment on that.
We have sister plants in 6 other states, and we also receive product from our Colorado plant, one of our Colorado plants. And as far as receiving goods, there's no change. As the doctor mentioned, you know, it's not been found on food packaging or processed materials. There's no change in how we're handling that handoff.
Thank you.
Similarly for us, I mean, again, we do ship semi-finished goods to sister facilities. Again, no change for that. But I think for Kraft Heinz and having it in multiple states, you know, we taken what other states are requiring and tried to unanimously apply them to all. So if one state, you know, so I think like Ohio was the first one to really recommend temperature screening. You know, so we started working on implementing those changes and didn't wait for, you know, Michigan to require that. So I think, you know, for us as a corporation, they've looked across, and if it's been required in one state, they really worked to how do we implement it across all factories in all 50 states.
Great, thank you. Would any of the panelists like to make a final comment, or Dr. Atkinson, before we move to the final announcements?
Yeah, my final comment is, you know, it's great to hear the resilience that you've all had and the way you've pivoted and managed, and congrats to those who continue to grow and meet the demand. I think it's, you know, I take my hat off to all of you because you're part of critical infrastructure. We've had to pivot, we've had to change, we've had to adjust. We continue to have to do that. And I think we all recognize the COVID weariness and just staying focused, because the next 3 or 4 months, it's going to get more difficult as it gets colder and the numbers change. And we have to continue to meet these challenges. So, you know, appreciate being part of this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks to all of our panelists. We're getting in plenty of quality, positive comments on what they heard. I certainly have learned as much as I thought I was involved in this through the association hat. You learn every time you talk with someone, and we certainly want to continue through the association, through Muskegon Area First and all of our partners to continue to support the food and ag industry beyond this pandemic.